Hello, and welcome to the second presentation by one of our guest composers at the 2020 Virtual Composers Conference. My name is Kurt Rohde, and I am the artistic director of the conference. Today, we are honored to have the second presentation by one of our. We are honored to have Amadeus Regucera talk about his work. Beginning more than a week ago, Amadeus and our other guest composer, Linda Catlin Smith, have been meeting with our Fromm Foundation Fellows and Contemporary Performance Institute instrumentalists in daily seminars, discussing an array of topics around, apart, and through musicking. And unless you've been inside these sessions, it's sort of difficult to explain exactly what they are. So this is our attempt to sort of get inside what happens in those sessions. And here we are today. Our format is quite simple. Amadeus will talk about his music and play some examples over the next hour. When he is finished presenting his work, our Fromm Foundation Fellows and Contemporary Performance Institute instrumentalists will join Amadeus and myself on Zoom, and we will begin the Q&A portion of the presentation for the remainder of the program. If you would like to ask a question, please post it in the YouTube chat scroll, and I will make sure we get to it. I simply ask that you try to make your questions succinct and clear. Amadeus Regucera makes work that engages with the embodied and acoustical energy of sound and the erotics of its production. In addition to concert music, his practice intersects with visual and performance art. Recent projects include new pieces for the Living Earth Show, the Echo Ensemble, the University of California at Berkeley Symphony Orchestra, the Left Coast Chamber Ensemble, the Berkeley Symphony. He was recently commissioned by Splinter Reed's Woodwind Quintet to compose a new multimedia work for the fall 2020. And now, without delay, Amadeus Regucera.
Thank you, Kurt, and thank you to the Composers Conference for inviting me to participate in this year's edition. I'm truly grateful and humbled to be able to share my work with you today. I just wanted to mention that the title of this talk is Finding the Erotic in Music, or Composing Music as a Path Towards Connection. I've never been able to separate my creative life from the one I lived day to day. What composer can, really? And for as long as I can remember, I've been searching for a kind of intensity or presence that would help everything feel real to me. Everything about my upbringing and my adolescence was physical. My body was a corporeal, fleshy container I never asked for, inside which I had to maneuver through a seemingly careless world. Of course, like any weird kid, I had an imagination that was too rich and perhaps too expansive, or so I was told. But I was always reminded that this imagination resided inside a body. In hindsight, I found my compositions to be manifestations of my subconscious. Like these pieces were trying to communicate something I can't articulate, but I'm always feeling. Hence, my process is often emotionally exhausting and fraught. It isn't the joyous process of discovery that I often hear from some of my peers. My compositional work then is like a catalog of lived experiences, or a ceaseless process of becoming and self-articulation, trying to make sense of myself in a world where I often feel confused and terrified, where my natural instinct is to retreat, never to take up too much space, never to speak too loudly, to disconnect and dissociate as a form of protection. From this perspective, it seems only natural that the experiences that seem the most real to me and the most vital are the ones that are the most intense, the loudest, the quietest, the ugliest, the most extreme, grotesque, and physically immediate. In terms of compositional material, I'm often drawn to and employ techniques that activate and provoke the body in some way. For instance, many composers have a particular way they approach the now ubiquitous technique of a scratch tone produced by a string instrument. Of course, there are many ways to play a scratch tone and many ways to use it. Upon first hearing one, I reacted to its abrasive sound, and in a very emo reaction, immediately felt like it reflected my own ugly subjectivity. So I used it as such, as a potent, expressive technique. What I slowly came to realize with this technique and many others was that the expressivity of it for me didn't lie in the technique as it was or as it's heard, but in the physical energy brought forth to it by an equally intense bodily movement and a degree of acutely focused concentration. I began to focus on the ways that I could somehow hear this physicality. So I developed a lexicon of techniques and strategies that would help me continue to get to that excited state when the physicality of the music could be felt. Techniques such as different inharmonic or noisy things and sounds and timbres, propulsive rhythms that emphasized upbeats, breathless tempos, extremes in dynamics and articulation, formal structures with outsized proportions and repetitions, or the integration of performers' voices in the dense and sometimes opaque orchestration. In my work from 2014, Crave, a duo for bass, flute, and harp, performed by my friends Stacy Polinka and Meredith Clark, I attempted to integrate many of these techniques in what ended up being a study of intimacy. So now I will go through the gymnastics of sharing my screen. And this is just an excerpt. So I think it was in this piece, Crave, that I discovered the potent sensuality and eroticism inherent in these techniques, and how they revealed another side to the performance of contemporary music, a practice that has been neutered by the formalist experiments of 20th century modernism. Following that, I wondered how this compositional approach and these techniques could be applied to larger forces. In Ophelia, Her Heart is a Clock, a piece of mine for 10 instruments from 2015, I set out to create a formal scenario in which the performers enacted their own music with and against each other, the sum of which became a kind of theater of instrumental music. I was actually quite happy with what I eventually stumbled upon in the writing of it. The piece's mood spanned the affective gamut. Its sound world seemed prismatic and mercurial. When I listened to it last night, I felt as if the ensemble itself resembled a body, or perhaps a Transformer, Voltron, or a Power Ranger Megazord, where the constituent parts were just as animated as the whole. But in this piece, I tried to make the ensemble breathe, pulse, slash, bang, speak, and scream. Often they are orchestrated in unison, musical figures muscling their way through some formal structure. In this way, the whole thing to me is a kind of exhibitionist musical spectacle. So now I'll play that. I was gonna play a white screen while you listen to this, but I don't wanna deal with that. So I'm just gonna play the, I'm just gonna play the audio, and you can stare at me if you want. In these pieces and several since, I'm searching for some sort of expressive threshold, that in some liminal space between a sound and the body that creates it, I could feel something. I wasn't sure what it was exactly I was looking for, but I chased after it like a junkie trying to relive my first fix. I continue to deepen and expand my investigation into the role of the performer's body within these two forms, the intimate and the spectacle. While the latter affords me the ability to paint large swaths of expressivity among large ensembles and orchestras, I think it's my exploration of the intimate that has shown and taught me the most, and so I'll speak more in that direction. In much of my work, there has always been an ethical dilemma in this regard. What right did I have as a composer for me to push my performers to some self-designed, expressive, and physical threshold in some masochistic, convoyeuristic experiment? I began to wonder what my part was in all of this. Why was there a line between my body and theirs in this experiment? What discussions around consent were or were not happening? What were the expressive limits of sound and how it's produced in these pieces? And when I say the expressive limits of sound, I mean sound in and of itself. What could sound do for me? And this is where I think I started to discover the limits of sound in of itself. And finally, was there some sort of traumatic cycle I was perpetuating by pushing my performers, ostensibly my friends, into performative situations that could potentially be harmful? I decided that if I was going to explore the expressive threshold, I had to do two things. One was involve my own body in the creative process in some way, and two, change the paradigm of collaboration. In 2017 then, I started a 10-month collaborative process with Stacy, the performer from Crave and other pieces of mine, flutist, on a piece for her on bass, flute, and piccolo, for myself, and video projections. For the first month or so, Stacy and I would just hang out. She taught me some Feldenkrais, some breathing exercises and stretches, and we would talk shop and spill the tea about the Bay Area music scene, where I worked in production and administration, where she performs regularly. We talked about her daughter's Waldorf education, cool pieces I'd found for the flute, her background, my background, discovered our common Catholic upbringing, and from there I began to examine with Stacy how certain traumas related to my upbringing could be recognized, expressed, and perhaps exercised through a performance ritual. From there, we explored the connection between ritual, endurance, breath, recitation, and tradition to create a form, and we experimented with movements, gestures, words, or techniques that could possibly articulate that form. Some of these gestures, like hyperventilating at fortissimo for 30 seconds to a minute, would render us exhausted, meaning that we could only rehearse or workshop certain sections once or twice a day. So the work was slow, sometimes grueling, but always rewarding. Somehow the compositional process was less fraught than before, and a sense of communitarian spirit and deep friendship emerged over the course of preparing this piece. From the beginning, I knew that this work would include projections, but what material, where they would be placed, what kind of imagery would be used, was all developed as the piece developed. The combination of the musical material, the movement, the props, and the imagery affected a kind of synthesis between intimacy and spectacle, and directly evoked the voyeurism implicit in the Western musical gaze. Moreover, I felt a kind of directness and immediacy through my own participation that I had not only built empathy and connection with Stacy, but with the audiences as well. So I'll play the first about 5 minutes of this piece, and it's called "The Trauma You Keep Safe is the Pain You Pass Along."
In hora pro nobis, in nobis hora pro
I am ripped apart
by bullets.
I
am cut down with a knife.
I am
Drowned. Drowned in the ocean.
I am
burned alive. I am struck down by oncoming traffic. I
am falling to my death. I'm not worried. I'm
not afraid. I'm already dead.
So immediately after this piece, I was approached by Andy Meyerson, percussionist with the Bay Area duo The Living Earth Show, to write a new work for solo percussion. I'll just read now from my original program note. Excuse me. When Andy asked me to develop a piece with and for him, the first thing I did was ask how far he was willing to go physically. His seemingly cavalier answer was, as far as you want. I knew Andy mainly through his work with the Living Earth Show, more though only through professional engagements, which is to say I didn't know Andy at all. Though I didn't know him that well, I knew him to be a committed player, an even more committed advocate for new work. I wanted to respect that, but also push Andy into a liminal space where the music making process was new and extremely challenging for me as well. I wanted to create a piece for him that reflected my interests in bringing together movement and music, but was singularly rooted in the body and visceral relationship between the three. As a percussionist myself, if only formally, the bass drum was always the instrument that spoke most to me personally. It was a body unto itself, skin stretched across a frame, the bowels of the orchestra, resonating at the depths of any instrumental group, mysteriously grounding a musical texture with its spectral rumbling, sometimes unheard, but rarely unfelt, but whose presence is also violent and immediate when struck. In this piece, I treat the drum as Andy's partner, an other that is gazed upon and caressed, but it's also a surrogate for Andy's body and vice versa. Bringing together two different bodies in this sensual and physical way also implies a sexual dimension, but not always so. There's a lot of gestural and material symbolism in the piece, but I hesitate to say that it all has to do with sex. It has to do with power, with dominance, and who has the agency to inflict and receive pain. Within the context of the composition, one might point out that the bass drum doesn't have this agency, yet to me, the musical instrument and its sounds are not innocent. The instrument, how it's played and how it sounds, is couched in history and in a musical tradition, one which colonizes and punishes its practitioners, and one which I am complicit in and a victim of. I don't really want to go into the ins and outs of being a Filipino-American composer trained in a Western European tradition and who participates in a community and who participates in its community. The intricacies are implicit in that sentence, the deed is done. What I want to do with my training is to continually tease out the generative aspects of the problems inherent in that cross-cultural morass. I want to find out what I can mine for impactful creative work. In the same way that the composition deals with power, I had to reckon with my own power as a composer with Andy as a performer. The composer-performer paradigm as it has become, it's shifting now, in the late 20th century almost made the performer a slave to the music and indirectly or directly to the composer. This was always weird for me. Some strands of virtuosic contemporary music of the recent past is masochistic, straight up. I wanted to make this blatant in this piece, yet I wanted the process to involve something that is often absent in contemporary music, a performance practice, yet is so foundational to physical relationships, and that is consent. When Andy said, as far as I wanted, this wasn't carte blanche for me to inflict untold harm onto Andy. When he strikes himself and hyperventilates or holds his breath to sing to the point of exhaustion, I ask him to do it because we've both agreed that it adds something of artistic or aesthetic merit to the piece. I was always ready to change something if we didn't both commit. Why I chose the musical actions I did are because of my tastes and my background. Andy got to know those things as the piece was written. As we got to know each other over the course of many breakfasts and many rehearsals, traveling together and working closely, in essence, developing trust. My personal cultural musical background and my tastes are all very physical and very violent. That is my inheritance. I needed Andy's consent before that became his inheritance also, as the performer of a piece of music from a composer. Andy asked me an interesting question recently when I wondered what to write here in this program note. So what does it mean that you, the audience, then are participating in that inheritance? You were not part of this long conversation about consent. I confess that I don't have the answer. When I speak of violence, I also speak of trauma, that subterranean current of dread that passes from one to another by sheer force of time, sometimes generations. I don't know what to say about it other than I don't think I can ever get rid of mine. There are a lot of psychotherapeutic ways to deal with it, some more accepted than others, but they all seem a little inept at teaching me how to get rid of it. But some are more helpful than others in helping me deal. Repetition is a common and useful rhetorical musical device in terms of memory and defining form. It's also incredible at cementing a difficult memory into our bodies. If we relive something terrible repeatedly, it's unclear whether it remains more securely or whether it will eventually leave us. Lately, I've just been trying to find healthier ways of integrating, or at least trying to. One of these ways is to ritualize repetition in musical form. I'm never after catharsis usually, or transformation in my music, but I often try to find some kind of release, both in the score, measure to measure, and in the process of making music. Part of that process is meeting new performers, simpatico with my musical desires and experiments. By witnessing this performance in this video and listening to what I've said about its creation, you've also watched the development of a friendship. Okay, so I'm gonna play a bit of this piece. And I forgot to mention this in the last piece also, that I should offer some sort of trigger warning and a warning about flashing lights. So also an epilepsy warning. So, and I'm gonna play about 7 minutes of this. Oh. The collaborative process. Okay. The collaborative process I went through with Stacy and Andy were very different, mainly because the dynamics between Stacy and I and Andy and I are so different. These differences, of course, were shaped by our individual and discrete perspectives and bodies, which became parameters in the development of the music, just as pitch, rhythm, or timbre are. So finally, what are the erotics of sound production? To me, it's the centering of the physical body or bodies in music making, the intense physicality that is the foundation of musical performance. It is also the examination of how a body, as a physical form and as a container for personal experience, as a nexus for multiplicity of possibilities for subjective expression. An aesthetic reading of the word might tend towards sensuality, a tactile sensuousness, touch, breath, force of gesture, or utterance, the sensory experience of music and its power. As a composer, it's how attuned we are to these things that create sound, music, and how we can organize, arrange, share, or even manipulate them to create a musical situation where the vitality of being a living human being can be felt by the performer and the audience. Okay, I'm running out of time here. I have one more video I want to share and then a short conclusion. So bear with me, I think this will be pretty chill. All right.
Ready whenever.
Roll?
Rolling.
Funny thing about air is it's wet. Even when it's hot, when the air seems so dry, it feels like it's suffocating you. It's still wet. And your breath, the air that comes out of you, well, it's wet too. It's moisture, spit, body fluids, same as piss or sweat. It's you, or at least the part of you that leaves. The ancient Greeks called the breath pneuma. To them, the pneuma was a person's spirit, their life, maybe their soul. I think it's interesting to think of a wind instrument as a tube that channels a person's spiritual self, but also their basic physical excretions. The work your body does to produce sound, the liquid your body expels when it does this work, the sound a person produces when they do this work. The sum of these things, to me, is music. When the most important thing to me about art is taken away, a person's body, or it's flattened to a two-dimensional reduction of an infinitely complex combination of physicality, athleticism, experience, personality, history, beliefs, focus, intention, and spirituality, it's hard not to feel that the impossible just got harder. So I move in close, as close as I can. Like leaning into a video call, I pretend that I can close the distance between me and that thing that's absent. It's still not there, but at least I can get close.
Oh yeah, feel free to LaCroix.
Thank you.
Okay.
Excellent.
Nice. Yeah, I think that looks good.
Yeah. You want to do weird stuff? You were?
The camera. I'm in normal
No, not you.
On Sunday, you'll hear a performance of my recent and only work for solo piano, Portraits for a Quiet End, a set of 4 quiet miniatures that were composed as companions for some of Yuri Kyotag's Yatakok. Here I wanted to focus on the erotics of touch, a single finger upon the key, the gentle force of pressing it, the lyricism of its release, and how the pedal makes this minute encounter linger just a little longer. It's a micro-intimacy, but like all miniature forms, has the potential to communicate universes. I've spoken on the role of my identity in my music, how it has informed my techniques, my thinking, and my path. And in the past few years have come to a resolution that I am in fact attempting to communicate. Just not doing very well, I think, maybe, I don't know. Earlier in the conference, Kurt had begun to explicate the difference between communication and connection, with the former having to do with an explicit message to deliver. I still have not been able to explicitly articulate what I'm trying to do with my music or why I still compose, when everything around me and everything about our world suggests my irrelevance. I suppose that feeling I was searching for, that excited state that drew me into this direction, was a sense of connection, what endless swiping, tapping, and cruising on various apps might promise but often fail to deliver. That the expressive threshold I approached or sought wasn't necessarily a place from which I could simply show or tell people who I am, or what I would do, or why you should like me. Instead, that threshold, I think, is a place where I can invite someone else, someone I trust and who trusts me, to share an experience with true connection. So to finish, at the risk of repeating myself, composition is the mode by which I constitute and communicate myself, and it is the means by which I invite others to do the same with me. The end.
Thanks, Amadeus.
Okay, so I went a minute over. My bad.
That's pretty impressive to come in exactly at the minute over mark, especially when you at the top said you were, when we spoke earlier, it was going to be about an hour. So, and you hadn't read through it, so that was perfect.
Into composer's intuition.
That's right. It really paid off.
PhD.
So I guess at this point, if people on YouTube would like to put a question into the chat scroll, that'd be great. I'll copy it and ask it. And then in a few moments, we're going to open up the Zoom rooms or invite everyone in to ask their questions. And I wanted to start, if I can, to get things rolling. And you don't have to answer this because I'm not even sure what I'm asking. So as you and everyone at the conference may have figured out, I'm not exactly a succinct question asker, which is funny given that
And really I'm not a succinct question answer.
Oh, good. So. Good. I generally like succinct questions, and I always ask for people to do that. But in fact, I approach things sort of elliptically, and I have just accepted that my thinking is formed by a string of tangents, and my intuition somehow tells me that it's the right thing to do. So in asking this question, I'm trying to work things out. So I as I mentioned to you earlier, when I was preparing for this, I had I set aside a bunch of time to listen to your work again, and in sort of in a concentrated period of time, and then read texts and watch videos, all in concentration. And went over the notes from the forum meetings, and a lot of words repeated, and I made a little word cloud, and just did all the things that help organize my fragmented brain. And the reason I did it, I tend to do do it this way is that I'm really always trying to become familiar with the body of the work by a particular artist, and understand the frame of that work by what the artist is saying, either directly or indirectly or indirectly. Like, you know, sometimes we talk about making muffins, but in fact, we're talking about our work. And see how that fits into my imperfect framing of their work. So, regarding moving in as close as you can, which is a beautiful, I guess it's sort of almost like a sort of a mini self-mission. You mentioned a lot the ensemble, the instrument as a body. And I'm wondering, do we need to visually see the players playing your music to understand the corporeal nature, embodied investment in the production of the sound? Is ear listening enough? And can you talk to the need of listening with our eyes? I'm asking this because I sort of wonder if there's this Amadeus diegetic extended technique you're sort of doing in your work. Because our new music culture is still really oral centric. And I think there are a lot of problems with that. And then when you get to work like yours, which have original texts and original visuals, those materials are not just like integrated, they hold the same power as the sonic materials because they are also sounding themselves. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit to the need to see what we hear.
So this is an interesting question, also because something we talked about earlier is that I promised myself I wasn't going to name drop, but
You're allowed one.
I have two right now off the top.
God.
So I remember, so I did an installation, one of my first works where I inserted myself into the work, which was a durational performance installation where over the course of 2 or 3 hours, I wrote in white chalk on a white wall, just the rosary, which is funny because my mom is sending me rosary things every morning right now. Bless her. I love my mom. So this was something that was really important to my upbringing and to me, and it sort of had the sort of repetitive ritualistic nature. And so I started thinking about what that meant. And the person I was working with at the time was Peter Ablinger, who is a weirdo in the best sense. You know, I grew really close to him and we had a lot of meetings and conversations about the visual aspect of listening. And I remember walking into his studio in Berlin and you couldn't really walk in because there were these sheets of A4 paper with various objects just sitting on them, like a removed car radio or, you know, a sound object. So basically things that looked like you can hear what the sounds were. And they were all just sitting in neat, you know, rows of 10 on the floor of his studio. And he was like, oh, this is just a new project I'm working on. You know, it's my new written work, you know, sound on paper. And I was just like, that's clever, you know, and you know, so I, you know, it was really impactful for me to see that because I'm actually a visual person, you know. I like a lot, you know, Linda yesterday or 2 days ago said, if you don't have a painter friend, you should get one because the perspective that they bring to music, traditionally an oral tradition, is priceless. And so the other person I want to name drop is my friend Jessie Marino, who has slowly been moving towards soundless music, right? So she has these gestural pieces where you're just kind of seeing this, or you know, some sort of just physical movement. And, you know, there's a lot, she's written and talked a lot about this, but how that also can be music. You know, we think about dancers and choreographers and how they work, you know, make friends with dancers and choreographers also, and you'll get a sense for music that isn't necessarily sounding. So To answer your original question, in those earlier works, like 5 years ago seems like an eternity, but like in earlier works, I really was trying to make it so you didn't have to see my music. It's like, how physical can I make the sound so that it's like the opposite of what Peter was doing in his studio. How physical can I make the sound so that you can see it? And you know, what kind of force and connotations, what can come through the airwaves and physically hit you? Because at the time I was just like, you're right, our tradition is mainly oral, and I have to work in that tradition. I have to circumscribe myself within a certain set of work, a certain way of presenting my work, composing it, writing it. So I don't know, and I just kind of grew tired of that a bit. And I'm like, well, I've got a video camera, and I can say stuff. It doesn't have to be, oh, what are they trying to say in the music? Well, I am trying to say this right now with my words. You know what I mean? So it's like, I don't know. I guess I'm not a subtle person.
I don't know. It seems like you're very sophisticated with your you're not being subtle. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Thanks. Why don't we open up the Zoom so people can turn on their videos? And if there's somebody who would like to ask a question, why don't you just go right ahead and unmute and ask Amadeus a question. Or I can start with a YouTube question.
I've got one, if that's okay.
Okay, great, Sebastian, please go.
Thanks, Amadeus. That was really cool. One thing I'm curious about is the visual aspect, kind of along the line of what Kurt was asking. What comes first? Like, does the visual aspect come first and then you write music to match that? Are they kind of linked together? Or, you have the music in your head and then that leads you to the visual?
Well, I guess it depends on what visual you're talking about. You're talking about like sort of projections. You're talking about what you're seeing on stage, like the visual of the performer, because actually that's what I start with.
Okay.
But also they're connected, right? So like if you're holding your bow and your viola and you're doing that, just sort of like strangling your instrument, like you can kind of imagine what sound that makes, right? Or if you throw your viola against the wall, you know what sound that makes. So I mean, to me, gesture and movement are always gesture and sound are always sort of, it's like this weird Ouroboros where they're sort of eating each other's tails. So to me it's always the same. But like being a visual person, and Kurt, going back to your question that relates to this, is that we always we're going to concerts and we're seeing people live. I don't just understand that the separation between this oral and visual thing that we've been talking about for hundreds and hundreds of years. But like, yeah, I mean, there's something very striking about when someone plays their instrument, and we often comment on it, but oftentimes they're asked to erase a lot of that stuff. Don't make your bow changes. They've got to be, indiscernible, or, where your breaths happen in that first C sharp of a prelude to an afternoon on a farm, and, it's just, that's the training and that's the discipline and that's the punishment. That is inherent in Western music. And I'm just like, but that's where all the good stuff is, the person's breath, why they breathe there, what's going on, like, to see the athleticism, and then not just to see it, then to foreground it. What does that sound like? So what does it sound like if I ask you to do that thing you practiced over and over and over again? When I write a piece where you play that over and over and over again, so that you not only get this weird kind of music and this maybe this weird kind of form, maybe interesting, I don't know. But you see you do it, and specifically you know, so you have a chance to say something in that instance as well. I don't even, what was the question?
That answered it.
Oh, okay. I should also say, and I said this in one of the forums too, is oftentimes if I'm stuck, I'll like sit and I'll imagine being in the audience, a sort of anonymous, unknowing audience member. And I'll imagine what I'm seeing on stage. And what the first movement is, where they're coming from, what's happening, what are the lights like, what's the first sound that's being heard. And from there, sometimes I'll start writing. It either becomes the beginning of the piece or it's somewhere in the middle, but somewhere in the process, I'm imagining what it looks like on stage, if it is a stage. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else here on Zoom with a question?
Good.
Corey.
I had a thought when I was watching the percussion solo. You said I can't remember the name. The percussionist had said that he would go as far as you would ask him to go, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
So to me, that kind of begs the question, how far are you willing to go? And how far are you willing to ask somebody to go?
Yeah. So that's an interesting question. You know, Sarah in our symposium last week talked about the projects moving at the speed of trust. And that was really interesting to me because that's often a slow process. And, you know, my taste level is a little suspect sometimes, you know, as far as aesthetics and, you know, the grotesque. I'm willing to go quite far, but, you know, it's a lonely road to go it alone. So, and it's also just like, what's the point, you know? So I often find like, I mean, if I find someone who's willing to, and I don't know what that looks like, we're talking in abstracts here, like go as far, you know, I mean, you know, part of like my studies and sort of readings and watchings and stuff have been like trying to find looking at the extremes in art, visual art, video art, theater, dance. And after a certain point, it stops saying something meaningful to me and becomes spectacle in and of itself, which is, you know, part of, you know, some art. But for me, I guess it's always been about, like I said, always been about connection, right? And so sometimes if you go too far, you start alienating instead of inviting. And, you know, I guess maybe I'm not answering your question, but like, I'd say quite far. And that usually takes me outside the performance practice of Western contemporary music. And it takes me into places that I don't know, you know, like this thing with the video. I didn't know how to use a video camera. I still kind of don't. I have like a bunch of YouTube tutorials that I have to look at before I use my cameras. You know, I have all sorts of like stuff that can help me push that, you know, all of that macro photography and macro videography was like super new. It's just like, how do you keep the thing in focus if you're that close? You know, so it's like learning new things. Like those aren't things I learned in my PhD, you know? So, I don't know. Do you have any follow-up thoughts? Because I don't know if I answered your question. I mean, the answer to your question is quite far. But I want people to come with me because, you know, it's fun.
No, I think that answers that question. Thanks.
Great. Would you mind if I give you some YouTube questions?
Sure, I forget they're out there in the YouTube.
They're out there. Here's one. What do you think is said or expressed by the elements that are left unused or left unsaid in your work?
It's a tricky question because I can't really even put I can't even put words to the things I'm trying to say and express, and the techniques that I am actually using. So to think about the expressive potential of things that are implicit or unsaid or even unknown to me is really hard to get at. But I would also say that the techniques that I do use were the things that are unused, unsaid, unspoken of in the tradition. So in a weird way, I've amplified those and made those the primary material. So I've taken what was discarded and made that the focal point of a lot of my music. So maybe there's stuff that I have discarded that is and if I have discarded it, like maybe traditional melody, heck, you can go find that yourself. You know what I mean? It's like why I don't want to write symphonies, because there's so many good symphonies, you know? I just go listen to them. Like I don't have personally anything to add to that, that body of work. A body of work, I should say. I'm a huge classical music nerd. You know, what composer, well, yeah, I mean, to agree, I feel like most composers are nerds, you know? But, you know, and it's not out of reverence that I don't want to add anything to that. It's like out of, you know, I've only got so much time in my life, and I'd rather get real up close to like a dripping brass instrument than write like a 40-minute symphony, you know? I don't know. Did I answer the question?
Yeah, you know, that your answer might even actually sort of connect to this next question on YouTube, which is, do you feel most connected when you work with a soloist or in a duet? Or do you also find you can get close to the intensity and vulnerability in large ensembles as well?
So I knew this question was going to come up because I get asked it a lot. How intimate, because intimacy sort of implies a kind of one-on-one or like two, like small group or whatever. But, you know, there are different levels of intimacy, you know, I mean, and the sort of thing with the erotics is I thought about this, especially in my work with student orchestras. So I went to school at UC Berkeley, I still teach there, and I have a really close relationship with the university orchestra. And it's ostensibly students, some community members, some grad students, but they play the hell out of everything. You know, to them, a piece of mine is the same as a piece of Beethoven's. And so there's this process where we're all learning how to do something. I'm learning how to work with them. You know, I used to be the manager. It was a sort of TA position as the manager for like 4 or 5 years. That's how I got out of teaching musicianship. And I got to know the kids, you know, the students, you know, if they were having a hard time in their microbiology like class and we're going to come late to rehearsal, I covered for them or something. You know, I would just sort of, you know, in the green room when they're waiting to swap out wind players, or, you know, string player was having a hard time, you know, I mean, it's so you got to know them. And then so that led to a kind of dedication on their part, you know, to get to know me, which was mainly through my music. So, so in that sense, depending on how much you're willing to give, I've found that you receive sort of a proportional amount. And so I guess that's my biggest issue is I'm maybe too willing often to sort of share myself with folks, which is like whatever. I'm working through it.
Yeah, well, it's not whatever, but I mean.
Yeah, no, I mean, we talked last week about boundary setting, you know, I mean,
Yeah,
that's a huge thing in performance practice. You know, we talked, I think yesterday, about the employer-employee relationship, that's often the case in composer-performer relationships. You know, that's some like capitalistic bullshit. I don't buy that. You know, I don't want to come in like a mercenary. That's not how, to me, that's not how art works.
Thank you. I have another question here, and then we'll go back to the Zoom. It says, it seemed to me that word has been morphing its role in your music. It seems that the more physicality gained power, that physicality has been gaining power in your music, the more physicality gains power in your music, words lose their strength to the extent that in your last piece, words were there, but as a commentary, as if words were one step back from the body, trying to get close to it, but they are not the body. Would you please explain whether your approach towards the power of words or language has been shifting in your art? Specifically because language has been always dominant over matter.
That's a great question. I just like, the first thing that comes to mind, so I'm kind of like a movie nerd that watches, this is a whole nother topic, but the way I watch movies is perverse. I don't watch them from beginning to end. I watch them in chunks that are anachronistic. Anyways, you know, there's this whole thing in filmmaking where it's like, or exposition or anything, it's better to show than tell. I mean, I think that's an adage in a lot of mediums, but in the beginning, you know, one of my first works from 2008 had voice and text and all this stuff. And I thought in art, or in music anyways, that's how you sort of directly communicated with someone. How you directly expressed what was inside and what was outside. And then, you know, over the course of time, it's like this person asked the question, is right, I was just like, why am I saying this? Why am I saying this? Why can't I just show it? How are there ways to show it? You know, that was part of the process of figuring that out. You know, it's like, thinking back, you know, it's much more literally impactful this is really, I don't know, this is weird. I'm bad at metaphors, but like literally impactful to sort of smack something. And what is the meaning of that versus, you know, calling you a name or something. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, there are different ways of getting at the same thing, and maybe one is more insidious than the other, you know. But yeah, the words, I think, carry meaning, but I don't know what I'm trying to say. I like this question and I want to answer it the best I can, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, there are things in relationships that your friendships or whatever, you know, where it's just like, if you know someone, if you give them that look, they know what you mean. You don't have to say anything. It's almost like that, you know. Or like very subtle shifts in body position, you know, say so much. And I wish I could just leave it at that, but unless you're in that dynamic, you don't know what's happening. So it's just like, I give my friend a look, and then the other friend at the table says, what was that look, you know? And depending on where you are with that other friend, you say, well, you know, then you spill the tea and you're like, oh, well, see her over there, you know, or something like that. You know what I mean? So it's like, we have to then use our words to communicate that thing that I was able to communicate with someone else without using words. You know what I mean? So
yeah. It's almost like you have to toggle back and forth based on the situation.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you've answered the question.
Yeah, I mean, as far as texts go too, I really like text. I really like words, and I read books and things the same way I watch movies, which was wrong. You know, I will read a passage or I'll read 10 pages out of a novel, and I will just hone in on individual words and how they sound, and even in poetry, you know, oftentimes I gravitate towards atomized poetry. You know, uh, Emily Dickinson, very succinct, you know, especially the ones she wrote on the envelopes, you know, it's just like, you know, you atomize the language to a degree, you condense it to a degree where words contain pages and books in and of themselves. And so I sit with those like koans sometimes. I just sort of like, that's a cool word, or a set of words, you know. Like, speaking of which, you know, the most recent orchestra piece I wrote, I titled "Eternity Will Be Velocity," which is, you know, from Dickinson, and just like that, just those 3 words or 4 words, sort of just like over and over and over again. What does that mean? And also the sounds so nice. I don't know. So I don't know what I'm trying to say.
You said what you know, and you've said what you don't, and they're both answers. Let me take some more questions from Zoom, and then we can close up. Anybody from Zoom? Going once, twice, 3 times. This is the most I'll ever be.
I guess I don't really have a question, but just like a comment. I just want to say I really appreciate like your comment, Amadeus, about like taking what's been discarded in classical music and kind of like, you know, you know, making something of it and really like appreciating it. And I've even noticed, just as like a listener and audience member myself, it's like sometimes, especially on recordings, I've heard like performers like kind of apologize, like, oh, you can hear me breathing, you know. And I'll say like one of my favorite violists is just like a lot of her recordings, you can like very audibly hear her breathing. And for me, like, even though I'm just listening, there's something like that's so enriching about it, because that sound, like I can imagine like the physicality of the performance. And so, yeah, I want to say I really appreciate like what you're doing with your work. So
thanks. Yeah, I mean, the breathing is so important for everybody, right? The breathing and the cueing and all of this stuff, you know, that's really interesting to me. Always has been. Because I'm not in that world, you know, I'm not a chamber musician or a string player. You know, I just played in bands, so it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, go. So the choreography that isn't the playing is, and everyone does it differently, you know, different, like in string quartets, different first violinists or whoever's conducting styles is so interesting to watch. I'm often distracted.
Well, thanks so much. I apologize for not getting to all the YouTube questions at the end, but we've run out of time. We need to move on.
You can hit me up.
You can also contact Amadeus at his website. He'd be more than happy to do that.
Yeah, I mean, maybe not the website. There's this whole weird like contact form or whatever, but you can if you want to,
sure.
If you like filling out forms.
Oh, gosh.
I mean, I love filling out forms, but that's a whole nother talk.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for the talk, the presentation. This was super, and thanks for being here this summer. It's been wonderful having both you and Linda, and we're all so grateful.
Absolutely been a highlight of my summer. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Some reminders about the upcoming Composers Conference events. Tonight at 6 o'clock, we have Meet the Contemporary Performance Institute Instrumentalists here on YouTube. And then we have the final 2 events, our gala concerts. The first concert is Saturday, tomorrow at 6 o'clock here on YouTube, which will feature the premiere of 5 new collaborative works by our Fromm Fellows and CPI instrumentalists, and pianist Margaret Kampmeyer performing music of guest composer Linda Cowan-Smith. And then on Sunday, we will have our final concert, our final gala concert. It will be August 9th at 6 p.m. It is the premiere of the remaining 5 collaborative works, and Margaret Kampmeyer will be performing a piano work by Amadeus. So I hope you will all be able to join us. And until then, thank you so much and have a great